Welcome. I want to talk about positive youth development through sport, but particularly in the context of how we might plan for the change that we're hoping to make. So one issue which I'd really like to suggest to everybody is that if we continue to do the same things over and over again, then it's unlikely we're actually going to make the changes that we want to do. So that's why this quote from Einstein is kind of important. We need to be thinking creatively about the options about how to make change. Okay, so let's take this a bit further forward. The PYDS, Positive Youth Development Through Sport, kind of has some assumptions often built into it. And one of the assumptions I want to get us to think about is the idea that because we do it, because we provide it, then that's going to create change. And I think that that idea may be true, but it also at times is a problem. So we need to move on from that, and we need to think about stand back from that and think about what are our policy objectives that underpin what we want to do. And if we look across the spectrum of policies and organizations that are involved in sport for development, then we see that there are kind of three areas that we need to think about. The first one is that we want to create life skills. We want to use sport to create change within young people that make them better citizens, positive citizens. Now, we might generally call that socialization, positive socialization. The second area, which I think is slightly more problematic, is that communities or other organizations are concerned about the behavior of young people. And so what they want them to do is actually be pacified, to be model citizens, to not cause problems, not cause disruption, not be in gangs, not be doing crime, not be doing drugs, these sorts of things. So we might call that pacification. Get the boys off the street and the girls off the street, and that solves the problem because they're now actively involved in sport. That actually comes from part of my own history. Growing up in Belfast, we invested millions of pounds in sports facilities in Belfast during the Troubles because we wanted to get the boys off the street and the girls off the street. It didn't actually work. Maybe some people would argue it just made the boys throw the stones further and run faster away from police whenever they were in trouble. So we've got to be careful about that assumption. What we're really concerned with is transformative change. How can we use sport as a vehicle for transformative change in the young person's life? And that, I think, needs a more considered, systemic approach. We need to bring in a number of ideas here. And the model I'm going to suggest to you here kind of establishes some key phases or elements within this transformative change process. So how do we plan for transformative change? Phase one. We need to involve all the major stakeholders in the process. That involves sport organizations, but maybe police, maybe community organizations. It can be a wide spectrum of organizations who will have a viewpoint about what changes they want to see. It could even go up to local government, mayors, and various other people having a viewpoint in this. So that stakeholder meeting is important. But what is the task? The task is to agree what it is we want to change. That's the most important thing. And that everybody begins to get on the same page, that we're not working in different ways. Different stakeholders are not opposing other stakeholders and saying what it is they want to achieve. Because there could be a lot of funding going into this process. The second phase, and maybe this is a difficult phase, is what we would call root cause analysis. What are the root causes of the problems that underpin young people's behavior that are deemed to be problem? What are the root causes of their vulnerability? What are the root causes of their alienation and their concerns? So there can be a very diverse range of issues here. And we need to start thinking about those. So I'm going to introduce a term here, right? And the term is habitus. What we need to understand are the structuring structures, the things that pattern people's lives. Because if we don't impact those, they're unlikely to cause change. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. If we were working to create health outcomes for young people, and the issue of childhood obesity, we can teach young people about the value of exercise. We can give them opportunities to exercise. We can teach them about healthy diets. However, there's a problem. They don't buy the food. They don't determine quite often where they go and exercise. Those things are rooted in the family. So we need to work with the family structure that would empower that process. The habitus, the structuring structures come from the family. So targeting young people by themselves will not be sufficient. And there's strong evidence to say that it will not be sufficient. So we need to think about how we encourage people through personal agency to make a change, but we also need to help them understand and make those changes by changing the social structures. And that's a difficult issue, and that's a major challenge. Phase 3 is agreeing who needs to be involved. The stakeholders, some may feel, we don't need to be involved. We're interested, but we don't need to be involved. But we might identify other stakeholders. So again, this could be based on the community context. Do we bring in young people themselves? Are they empowered to be part of the process of change? Or are we deciding that other people come in? Do we involve schools? Do we involve schools? Do we involve schools or churches, mosques, synagogues? Who do we involve in the process? And that's a really important process. So, because that's going to set up who we collaborate with, who's involved in the process. And that's going to take a lot of negotiation. So we might want to view here that there's a need to identify and engage with what we might call internal stakeholders. That could be your own staff inside your sport organization. That could be the community groups that you're working with currently. But also it could be politicians and other structures that might be powerful influences on whether the funding is continuing and moving forward. Phase 4, we've got the idea, we've got these processes now identified. So what are we going to do? How do we build a structure that's going to help promote change? I would call this the systemic structure, the systems on which people are building. So in order to do that, we need to build up or tool up for success. We need training, we need development, and this is an important part of the process. Assuming everybody's already got the skill sets to create the systemic changes is probably a mistake. People will need to think things through, be engaged with training and other forms of development. Now we can move on to phase 5. And it's only now we really begin to design the programs. All these other processes underpin this. We don't start with the program and reinvent back. We go through these processes first, and then by phase 5, we can begin to think about program design. So thinking through positive youth development through sport, what's the design? What's the change we're trying to make? Because that can be very different. If it's trying to impact gang culture or other issues, that's different to impacting a health and well-being issue. If we're trying to work with young women versus young boys, that's again a different issue. What's the key change that we're looking to make? And different groups will create different problems around the design and activity phase. However, it's not just about what we do, it's about how what we do creates a different envisioning of the future. That's the purpose. These young people are not just turning up and taking part in activities. These activities need to give them a perspective that there's a potential for a different future. And that needs to be a convincing process. So, phase 6, we'll all encounter problems. This will not be just a straightforward process. Therefore, we have to be prepared to step outside of our assumptions and explore our creative options. We need to talk to others. We need to get advice where necessary, because if we want to be progressive and not just repeat the same old stories over again, we need to be prepared to think in different ways. So innovation becomes a major part of our design process and our delivery process, because innovation frees the future. If doing the old structures were good enough, then the future would be okay. So we need to move outside of these structuring structures, back to the idea of habitus again. So let's now consider phase 7. Here, we get a bit more organized, a bit more strategic in setting up some formal agreements, probably with our key stakeholders. Memorandum of understanding. Why is this important? Because it means that everybody is singing from the same page. Everybody is in agreement. And if people start drifting away and wanting to change or bring in different agendas, the memorandum's there to remind people to come back into the framework that we've agreed, the framework of change that we've agreed. So it helps create discipline around these processes. This is essential for our leadership, how we lead and how we define the process of change through a positive youth development process, because it focuses on what are our agreed objectives within the program, and it reminds everybody that they have signed up to this and they've agreed to this. So when there's difficulties or people change their mind or people leave organizations and new people come in, this is a way of creating and sustaining the process of change. So, moving on, we're now into the real phases of action planning and implementation. So, this is the straightforward task that most community sport coaches will be very familiar with, because this is the delivery phase. This is doing what we do. This is creating the sport activities, designing them, delivering them, booking out the sports halls and the fields of play. So we're working through the practical tasks, but remembering at the same time that these tasks are more than just activity tasks. They are designed to create change and impact within the young person's lives. So it's not about slipping back into an old model of sport development. We're going to teach skills. We're going to teach sports skills such as kicking a football or catching a basketball. It's about what is it we're trying to achieve through the delivery. Phase 9. We work in communities. We work with people. So as we become active and as the program becomes active, that will create a process of engaging directly within the communities that these young people live within. And that might create a need for dialogue, a need for thinking about who we're talking to and how the process of change that we're hoping to achieve are understood within the wider community. So we might call this managing the message. How are we talking to people? How are we convincing various groups through what we say and what we do and how we act that approves the way that we want to take the change process forward? Managing the message is also about how we work with politicians and how we work with the media, because all of these people may well have a viewpoint on what we do. If something negative happens, we need to be able to make sure that we move on from it and don't let the negative message take forward, but the positive message needs to be put forward. So, embodying the learning, making the learning real to the individual, living the learning, living the idea, becoming part and parcel of your lifestyle. That involves lifestyle change. It doesn't involve just a mental process, it involves what we do. So I might want to lose weight. I might want to help young people lose weight. At the end of the day, it's down to what they do. It's about making changes. It's about making decisions about those changes. So if I go into the supermarket, do I buy that large bar of chocolate? Or do I choose not to buy that large bar of chocolate? Do I see my body changing? Am I empowered by that sense of change? These are the kind of key things that we need to do. Okay, so there's one final phase that we need to think about in this process. And that is monitoring and evaluation. As we plan for sustainable and sometimes systemic change, we need to produce evidence. We need to think from the very beginning of the planning process how we're going to evidence this process, and then how we're going to use that evidence to create feedback processes to our funders, other stakeholders, because this will not be a one-off event. To create sustainable change means permanent and ongoing engagement in communities and with young people's lives. To sustain that, there needs to be an effective form of feedback going on, and that means we need to see monitoring and evaluation as an absolutely essential part of the process of building a systemic and strategic process of change. Without that, we just end up in a process of hope that whatever we do will end up producing what we hope it will produce. That won't be adequate. There will be another presentation which I think is going to give you a lot more detail on that. So to recap, if we, through our desire to create positive youth development through sport, see the process in its typical forms of producing activities for young people, it won't be adequate. We need to see this as a process that involves a process of change that requires planning, thought, the involvement of stakeholders in order to create a systemic process. A process that we can trust in, a process that can build in over time and therefore create real change, sustainable change in the lives of these young people. We cannot and should not see sport as just a series of activities that produce positive outcomes. Sometimes they do, but in many instances, that's not adequate. We need to plan and use the sport process in a far more creative and innovative way, and maybe we could use the term progressive way to create real and meaningful change in young people's lives. It has a potential, but we need to use that potential. Thank you.